This video is sponsored by Displayland. Today we're going to be going through the basics of lighting in Blender. Lighting can take your image from amateur to professionals very quickly, and I often get asked by beginner artists how they can improve their renders, and almost always it comes down to bad lighting. We're going to look at how I approach lighting in my scenes for my animations and my upcoming short film as an example to learn. So ray trace lighting, which is what the Cycles render engine uses, is actually very similar to how real world lighting works. So if you'd like to get better at lighting, it's best to study real world examples. Now I'll be covering a few lighting basics, but Blender Guru already has an amazing series on lighting, and I'll be focusing more on lighting in Blender and how to use Blender's lighting tools. However, first we will start with a few lighting basics, then move into actual lighting setups in Blender. First, let's focus on depth. Your render is a 2D image, and lighting will help convey depth in your image. Be intentional with your shadows and your highlights, and use them to wrap light around your object and complement the depth of your geometry. Next, make sure to pay attention to your color. Usually you do warm colors in the front and cool colors in the back to get that kind of blockbuster look. However, more recently, lighting has gotten a lot more experimental in films. You shouldn't lock yourself into traditional lighting colors, but you should adhere to color relationships. Let's go through some basic types of light that you can use in most simple lighting setups, which is your fill light, your rim light, and your key light. Now there are many more types of light than this, and you don't even need to use all of these, but we're going to use these as kind of a starter because there's some basic lights that are commonly used in most setups. As an example, we're going to be using this 30th birthday cake scene because it is very simply lit with these lights. Now it's worth noting that here I introduced a bit of color into the background, and I just did this as kind of an ambient fill to kind of brighten the scene and add a cheery bit of color. That's just something I like to do stylistically. It's not very common. For now, I'm going to get rid of that so that we can focus on the lights. Now, one thing I like to do when I am working on a lighting setup is I like to go one light at a time, dial in the controls, and make sure I know what each light is doing before I combine them all. I call this painting with light in a scene, and that comes from a book I read in film school called Painting with Light, which I highly recommend if you're looking to get better at lighting. So let's go ahead and look at what the sunlight does here. The sunlight in the scene is hitting from a higher angle from above, and what it is doing is serving as a highlight rim around the shape of our character with a hotter light, which is also known as a brighter light, meant to highlight our character and separate them from the background. This kind of shows us the silhouette of our character, and that's the purpose there. Let's go ahead up here and turn on this light. Now this would be an area light off here to the left, and this serves as our fill light. And you can see here this is like a dimmer light, and it is kind of splashed over a character with soft lighting, and you can kind of see that it's filling in a lot of these details so that when we combine it with other lights, there's not a lot of shadows on this character because I wasn't really going for a dark and dramatic look. Let's look at this last light here. Now this would be what is considered our key light, and you can see that this light is brighter and that it's off to the side and that I've hit from behind so that the light wraps around a bit and shows some of the shape of our character. Now the key light is often the light you're going to use to highlight the scene of importance. So if you had a character, for example, framed left, looking to the right, you would hit from this side with the key light so that your key light kind of faced the majority of your framing. So keep that in mind. That's not as relevant here because the cake is centered in the screen. Now let's look at the different types of lights that Blender has and how we can use those in scenes. Now to show off these next few lights in Blender, I want to use a more complex scene. Now these models were made by the Rusted Pixel, and he has a YouTube channel if you'd like to check it out, and this is for a course I'm doing for MoGraph Mentor. So up first, of course, is the basic point light. So if we go ahead and we grab this point light and let's start introducing a little bit of power, you can see that the point light is a circular light that emits light in all directions here. And if I just crank that up a bit so that you can see a bit more of the extreme effect, you can see that the light is coming directly here from the center of the light, and it is emitting in all directions. Now let's look at our light controls over here. We have the power, which of course is the wattage of the light, and this is actually calculated at a different rate. CG Cookie has a really good tool for doing this accurately if you're looking into that. Now changing the size of the light will change the size of like the ray trace shadows. So what it'll actually do is soften the light the more you do it. So if I crank this size up to like 1, for example, we'll see that all the shadows get softer. So the sunlight here serves as a sunlight in a scene, or also known as an infinite light. So you can see here that if I move the light around, the positioning here doesn't matter at all on this light because it is just shooting light in this direction infinitely. So you can see here we have this line pointing down, And what matters on this light is the rotation. Now, I found that a good strength for a sunlight most of the time when you're using a sunlight in your scene is about 10. I find that gives me pretty accurate sunlight strength, and I can kind of move that out. Now, this isn't as realistic because when you have a sunlight, you're almost always going to have harsh lights. But if you wanted to simulate kind of a cloudy day, what you could go ahead and do is you can take this angle here and you can crank it up. Now, if you crank this up too high, it will start to soften the shadows so much they will begin to wrap around the object in an unrealistic way. So you can play with that angle there, and that works similarly to how size does on other lights, in that it'll soften the shadows as it gets higher. Next up is a spotlight. Most people are familiar with this because of theater, and you can see here that we have kind of this light that shoots out into a spot. So it's only going to project this light in front of it, and Blender has these kind of handy controls to allow you to kind of move around where that light is pointing. And then of course we can adjust our power here, so let's crank that up, and you can see that we're getting light coming down there in a cone. Now down on this light, you'll see that you have extra controls for the spot shape. So you can kind of change the angle of that spotlight, how big it is, and then the blend here will determine how harsh of a fade fall off we have from there to there. Up next is the area light, which is the light that I use most often. And again, Blender has these kind of handy controls to make it bigger and smaller. And you can see that's changing the size here. And just with other lights, as the size gets bigger, it's going to get softer. But area lights in general are always going to be soft, unless if you make them really tiny. And here you have different shapes. You can do a rectangle, a disc, an ellipse. But honestly, you can come in here and you can just scale this light like you would an object to kind of fit your scene. So if you just wanted to get a little bit above, you could fit that there. And let's say we crank that up to about 1500. And you can see that we're showering our scene with bright, soft light. Another great thing about area lights is that when you click an area light, you'll see this option down here called Portal. And if you click that on, what it will do is it will actually deactivate the light. But what it will do is concentrate light through those holes and objects. So for example, if I was to turn it on with these here, then what it would do is deactivate this light, but it would tell light to kind of ignore around here and kind of pass light through there. So if you're doing an architectural rendering and you have a hole in the wall and you want more light to pass through that, you can turn on a portal light, put that in there, and put lights out there. And what that'll actually do is kind of produce less noise as the light comes in and help you kind of render quicker. You can also turn any object into Blender into a light using Mesh Emission, which just really is a fancy way of saying putting an emission shader on your mesh. And this is great if you're trying to get specific highlights or very specific light shapes in your scenes. Now the problem with this method is that it introduces a lot of noise, but it does give you a lot of control as well. This is also a great way if you want to introduce image textures into your scenes. And by introducing image textures into your lights, you can create various effects, for example, a stained glass window shining in, or whatever other stylistic needs you may come up with. Ies Texture Node is a way to add advanced light mapping. So lights don't really shine in kind of perfect manners. They always have kind of these patterns and shapes that come off of them from the bulb. So if you're going for a photorealistic scene, you may want to look at using Ies Textures. Now to include one of these textures, all you need to do is click the light, click Use Nodes, and then it will give you this setup here. You can add an Ies Texture node there, add that into your factor, and then you can go ahead and load an Ies material here. There are plenty for free online that you can use. A very common way to light scenes is by using an HDRI image. So an HDRI image has a bunch of color information in it, and it is used to use that color information and light your scenes realistically. So if I go ahead here and I turn off my transparency, you should be able to see that lighting image in the background. And that lighting image is actually a kitchen probe. So somebody took an HDRI image of a kitchen, and I'm now using that kitchen to light my kitchen. To go ahead and add an HDRI to your scene, what you do is you come to the World tab, you click this little button here next to your background, you click Environment Texture, and then you can just load your texture there. More often than not, it will be equirectangular. And with that, you can go ahead and light your scenes within HDRI. Now this is more of an advanced lighting setup, and this comes from more real world examples. So when you're lighting a scene in the real life, they call these cookies, where they put these places in front of the lights, and what it does is it has a bunch of random holes and things, and they use it to kind of fuse shadows to kind of add a little bit more of a dynamic look. Now with this, let's look at how to kind of light some of our scene using these lights. So I'm going to start with an example scene. So here is a basic scene that we will be using to kind of start how I do a lighting process from kind of A to B. Now this horse skull here is actually a photo scan asset from the sponsor of this video, Displayland. I photo scanned this with my phone in my living room, cleaned up the geometry a bit and retextured it, making it kind of a good object to use to lighten the scene, because it's got a lot of crevices and shapes that we can kind of highlight and try and show some shadows. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to start with a rim light. Now typically you wouldn't use a sunlight for a rim light, but I like it because it kind of gives me an infinite light. Over here, I will have my rendered view so that you can kind of see what the lighting's looking like as we go. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start rotating this light. And what I want to do is get this light so that it is pointing behind the object at the camera. So I'm going to kind of point there, and then I'm going to come down in my front view, and I'm just going to kind of make that angle a bit more extreme, because I'm really just trying to highlight the edge of my skull there, and I can kind of rotate that and play with that. And that's kind of what I want, is I want this kind of highlight moving along there. And I can even make this angle a little bit more extreme to kind of hide that, but I like a little bit of light wrap there. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to grab this, I'm going to crank this up because I want that to be fairly hot. And I don't want it to be so harsh as it's casting these shadows here. So I'm going to crank this up to a large number like 10, and that'll help me out there. Now I'm going to introduce a tiny bit of color into this. So now let's go ahead and add a fill. So I'm going to start using an area light there, and I'm going to rotate that 90 degrees. And let's see, I'll go into the top view here. I want that to kind of come off from this side of the camera, and we'll come at a bit behind an angle. And the reason I want to come from behind here is so that the light will hit here and kind of wrap around and hopefully give us a bit more depth. Now let's see quite how high we can crank that. That's a little too high, so let's drop back down to 500 watts there. And if I kind of take that, and I'm going to do that at a slightly higher angle, and that should give us a bit more interest of a lighting. Now I actually feel like that's wrapping around a bit too much, so let's see, I'm going to kind of intensify the angle here and bring that around so that we get a bit more shadows kind of showing kind of the sides of those skulls. And let's see if we crank that up just a tiny bit. And you can actually play with the color here. So like a common kind of like look in Hollywood is they'll do cooler lights on the back and warmer lights on the front. So we can go ahead and play with that. So I'm going to do a cooler light right there, kind of more of a cyan light. Now let's go ahead, let's add another area light, and we're going to use this as kind of our fill light. Let's bring this up top here. And again, we'll rotate that 90 degrees. I'm going to do negative this time, so it kind of faces off here. And I want this to kind of wrap around the front here, but not completely eliminate our shadow. So I'm actually going to scale this one up here. So let's go ahead, add 3, and that'll give us a softer light. And then let's go ahead and make that 500. And it looks like that may be too bright, but we'll kind of see when we kind of change the color here, it's going to desaturate the look a bit. So that may end up actually working. So we can kind of play with a more warmer light up front here. Now what I can do is I can go ahead and maybe add a little bit of light down here from the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead, add a point light. And then I'm going to come here into the front view, and I want this kind of on the camera side. And I'm going to put this down here to maybe introduce a little bit of light down there. Now, like I said, I like to turn off all my lights so I can see what each one's doing. So let's go ahead and see what this point light's doing. What we're trying to do is get a little bit of glow coming up here to kind of highlight some of the bottoms of these like ridges on the column here. But we don't want it to be too extreme. So let's maybe bump that up to 50, see what that looks like. We can maybe even play with a more ominous color like red. And now that we have kind of an idea what's going on there. And now we can see that we kind of have these warmer colors coming up here. And I feel like here we're getting kind of a lot of interesting colors mixing. And I'm really happy with how this looks. Let's talk a bit about our sponsor, Displayland. If you're looking to deep dive into lighting, then Blender Guru has a great lighting course on his YouTube channel. And what this does is not so much the specifics of lighting in Blender as much as it is just lighting in general. And it covers all the kind of lighting mastery that you may need in understanding lighting and where that goes. If you're willing to pay CG Cookie just released a Fundamentals of Lighting course, which goes through specifically lighting in Blender, and it has a lot of great and advanced tips. I really recommend it if you're interested in kind of deep diving into lighting. Let's go through how to use the Display Lane app. Models are created via a technique called photogrammetry, which traditionally involves photographing an object from a multitude of angles and then processing the images using specialized software. With Display Lane, you just record a video of the subject on your phone and all the processing happens automatically in the cloud. If you can't see the app in the store, your device is likely not supported. If your phone is older or more affordable and does not have AR Core, it will not work. Capturing is as simple as opening the app, pointing at your subject, and recording. Choose if you want to upload now or later, and once you've uploaded your model, Display Lane will process the model for you. Most often, this will only take a few minutes, but if it's a large scene, it could take up to a few hours. Display Lane will send you a notification when your model is ready. You can review the draft and decide if you want to publish it or not. You can also edit your model if you'd like here. Once you've published, you can view your model on the app, alongside other scans people have uploaded. Some are really cool. That's all for today's tutorial. Make sure to tag me in your creations on Instagram. I love seeing what the talented people in this community make from these tutorials, and oftentimes I'll share them to my own page. Thank you for watching.